Welcome to Blurr, the place where history's most mysterious trials come back to life. Tonight we step into a courtroom filled with tension, whispers, and unanswered questions. A case that once gripped an entire nation. A trial that sparked fierce debate about justice, truth, and doubt. At the center stands a woman whose name would echo through newspapers, courtrooms, and public opinion for years. Was it a tragic misunderstanding, or something far darker hidden beneath the surface? In this episode, we journey back in time to explore the trial of Florence Maybrick, a story of suspicion, scandal, and a verdict that continues to intrigue the world, even today. Before we begin, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, share with friends, and hit the bell icon so you never miss another chilling story from Blurr. Now, dim the lights, listen closely, and let the trial begin. Chapter 1. An American in Liverpool. Liverpool, in the 1880s, was one of the great commercial cities of the British Empire, a port whose docks received the wealth of half the world and whose merchant families had built themselves into a prosperous and closely knit society with all the ambitions, all the pretensions, and all the rigid social codes that Victorian prosperity made possible. It was a world of dinner parties and cotton brokers, of servants and subscription concerts, of outward respectability polished to a high and slightly anxious shine. Into this world in the autumn of 1881 arrived a young American woman who would, within 8 years, stand trial for her life and become the subject of one of the most prolonged and passionate public controversies in Victorian legal history. Florence Elizabeth Chandler was born in Mobile, Alabama, in 1862, the daughter of a banker father who died when she was still a child and a mother. Carrie, who was a woman of remarkable energy, unconventional habits, and an appetite for European society that she pursued with great determination across several decades and 2 continents. Florence had grown up moving between America and Europe in her mother's considerable wake, educated in fragments, exposed to the drawing rooms of Paris and the watering places of Germany, and formed by an upbringing that was, in its way, cosmopolitan as it was unstable. She was 18 years old in 1880 when she sailed from New York on the White Star liner Baltic. Aboard that ship she met James Maybrick, a 50-year-old Liverpool cotton merchant of established position and comfortable means. The difference in their ages was substantial, some 23 years, but age gaps of that kind were not unusual in the marriages of the period, and whatever the nature of the attraction between them, it was sufficient to produce an engagement and, in July of 1881, a marriage at St. James's Church in Piccadilly, London. Florence Chandler became Florence Maybrick, and she went to Liverpool to begin her life as the wife of a prosperous English merchant. The early years of the marriage appear to have been reasonably happy, or at least not conspicuously unhappy, in the way that many Victorian upper-middle-class marriages achieved a kind of settled contentment that was not passion, but was not misery either. They had 2 children, a son named James Chandler Maybrick, always called Bobo, and a daughter named Gladys Evelyn. They lived well, first in rented accommodation, and then in a house they took in the suburb of Aigburth called Battlecrease House, a large and comfortable Victorian villa that required a substantial staff to maintain and that advertised to the world of Liverpool society a prosperity that was, as would later emerge, somewhat more precarious than it appeared. But beneath the surface of this ordered domestic life, several things were wrong. James Maybrick was not what he appeared. He was a man of secret habits, of concealed anxieties, and of a dependency that he had been managing, not always successfully, for many years. And Florence, young and vivacious, in a provincial city, far from everything she had known, was discovering that the life she had married into was considerably more confining than she had imagined when she accepted it on the deck of an Atlantic liner. Chapter 2. James Maybrick and the Arsenic Habit. James Maybrick was, by any measure, a complicated man. He had built his cotton-broking business from modest beginnings into a firm of some respectability, maintaining offices in Liverpool and Norfolk, Virginia, and conducting himself in his professional life with the competence and discretion that his position required. He was a member of the right clubs, attended the right functions, and maintained, in public, the appearance of a solid and successful Liverpool merchant. What his colleagues and his wife did not fully appreciate, at least not initially, was that James Maybrick was addicted to arsenic. This was not in the Victorian period, as singular as it might sound to modern ears. The practice of taking arsenic as a tonic, stimulant, and supposed aphrodisiac was documented across Europe, with particular associations with the Styrian regions of Austria, where peasants were said to take increasing doses of white arsenic as a matter of habit, and to develop a tolerance that allowed them to consume quantities that would be lethal to an uninitiated person. The practice had spread, in modified forms, into the medicine cabinets and the pharmacies of Britain, and a significant number of Victorian men and women consumed arsenic in one form or another as part of what they considered a rational approach to health management. James Maybrick had first encountered arsenic during his years of working in the American South, where the drug was sometimes prescribed as a treatment for malaria and other tropical complaints. He had found that it agreed with him, that it gave him energy, and improved his sense of well-being, and he had continued to take it long after any medical justification had passed. By the time of his marriage to Florence, he was a habitual user, taking arsenic in significant doses on a regular basis, occasionally with strychnine and other substances mixed in, obtaining it from various sources, and managing his consumption with the practiced discretion of a man who knows that his habit would not be viewed kindly by the world around him. Florence eventually became aware of the habit, though exactly when and to what degree she understood its extent is a matter that the subsequent trial did not entirely clarify. What is clear is that by the mid-1880s, Battlecrease House contained, in various drawers and medicine chests, supplies of arsenic and other substances that James Maybrick had accumulated for his own use, and that Florence knew about at least some of. These supplies. The marriage, meanwhile, was deteriorating. James Maybrick had maintained a mistress in Liverpool for many years before his marriage, and he appears to have continued various extramarital liaisons during the marriage itself. Florence, for her part, became increasingly unhappy in a household that was dominated by a husband who was older, set in his ways, financially volatile despite appearances, and not above using both physical and emotional means to assert his authority. The precise details of their domestic unhappiness are necessarily incomplete, filtered as they are through the evidence of a trial conducted in adversarial conditions, but the picture that emerges is of a marriage that had become, by the late 1880s, genuinely miserable for at least one of the two people in it. Chapter 3. Alfred Brierly and the Races. In the spring of 1889, Florence Maybrick did something that she knew was dangerous, and that she presumably knew could have very serious consequences if it came to light. She began an affair with a man named Alfred Brierly, a cotton merchant and an acquaintance of her husband's, a man who moved in the same social circles as the Maybricks, and who was, by the accounts of those who knew him, reasonably prosperous without being remarkable in any particular way. He was not a man for whom anyone would have predicted that a respectable woman would risk everything. But Florence was not, by the spring of 1889, in a state of mind that made careful calculation easy. The affair came to a critical point at the Grand National Races at Aintree in late March and early April of 1889. Florence and Brierly spent time together at the races in a way that was, by the conventions of their social world, indiscreet enough to be noticed. More significantly, they spent at least one night together in London at a hotel near Piccadilly. Florence had explained her absence to James by telling him she was visiting an aunt. It was a lie that would not survive the scrutiny of a suspicious husband, and James Maybrick was, by this point, suspicious. When Florence returned to Battlecrease House, there was a confrontation. Exactly what was said and done during that confrontation is disputed in the accounts that survive, but it was sufficiently serious that Florence wrote to Brierly shortly afterward describing a violent altercation in which James had struck her, and she had been genuinely frightened. She wrote that she intended to seek a legal separation, that the situation had become intolerable. This letter, like so many documents in this case, would later be read and reread in the most unfavorable possible light. The confrontation over the Grand National episode did not produce a separation. Marriages in 1889, particularly marriages embedded in a social community as close-knit as Liverpool's merchant class, did not dissolve easily. There were children, there was money, there was reputation, and there was the sheer social inertia of a household with staff and obligations, and the expectations of two families. Florence and James continued to live together in the weeks that followed, in the particular atmosphere of armed hostility that follows a serious marital crisis that has not been resolved. And then James Maybrick fell ill. He had been in indifferent health for some time, but in late April of 1889, his condition deteriorated sharply. He experienced severe nausea and vomiting, numbness in his limbs, and a weakness that confined him increasingly to his bed. His brothers Michael and Edwin and the household staff became more and more concerned. Doctors were called, and in the household at Battlecrease, the atmosphere of a domestic crisis began to shade, imperceptibly at first, and then more rapidly, into something altogether more alarming. Chapter 4. The Illness and the Flypapers. James Maybrick's illness in the spring of 1889 progressed through a period of several weeks during which various doctors attended him and offered various diagnoses. The symptoms were, with the benefit of hindsight, consistent with arsenic poisoning, but they were also consistent with a range of other conditions, and the doctors who saw him during this period were not, initially, alarmed enough to suspect foul play. He had a history of gastric trouble. He was known to take various medicines and substances of uncertain composition, and Victorian medical diagnosis did not have the forensic tools that would later make the identification of poisoning considerably more reliable. During her husband's illness, Florence did something that would provide the prosecution with one of its most powerful pieces of evidence. She purchased flypapers. Flypapers of the Fowler's solution type, commonly available in Victorian Britain, were impregnated with arsenic, and it was a well-known domestic practice to soak them in water to produce a liquid that could be used as a cosmetic application, particularly as a complexion wash. Florence purchased a supply of these flypapers, and they were subsequently found soaking in a washbowl in her bedroom at Battlecrease House. Florence's explanation, which she maintained consistently from the time of her arrest through the trial, and for the rest of her life, was that she was preparing an arsenic-based cosmetic lotion following a recipe that her mother had given her, and that the practice of using arsenic as a skin preparation was one she had followed for many years. This explanation was in itself entirely plausible. The cosmetic use of arsenic was genuinely widespread in the Victorian period, documented in women's magazines, in beauty manuals, and in the testimony of numerous women who gave evidence at various trials and inquiries of the era. But the timing of the flypaper purchases, coming as they did during her husband's illness, and in the context of a marriage that was known to be in serious difficulties, was deeply damaging. The prosecution would argue, and would argue with some effectiveness, that a woman who was soaking arsenic from flypapers while her husband lay dying of what would turn out to be arsenic poisoning had a great deal of explaining to do. Florence's explanation was available, but it required the jury to accept a remarkable coincidence, and remarkable coincidences are not easy to sell to juries in murder trials. There was a second episode that the prosecution used with even greater effect. On or around May 9th, Florence was observed by a nurse named Alice Yap, who was employed at Battlecrease House in connection with the children, handling a bottle of meat extract that was intended for her husband. Florence was seen, or was said by Yap to have been seen, doing something with the bottle that Yap could not precisely describe, but that she found suspicious enough to mention. When the bottle was subsequently examined, it was found to contain traces of arsenic. Whether Florence had added arsenic to the meat extract, whether the arsenic was already present in the bottle from some other source, or whether the observation and its interpretation were colored by other factors, these were questions that the trial would contest vigorously and never entirely resolve. Chapter 5. The Letter and the Nurse. Alice Yap occupies a peculiar and contested position in the Maybrick story. She was a nursemaid, employed to look after the Maybrick children, and she was, by the time of the events of May 1889, deeply involved in the domestic surveillance of Florence Maybrick in a way that reflected both the particular tensions of the Battlecrease household and, some have argued, her own personal animosity toward her employer. On May 8, 1889, Florence gave Yap a sealed letter to post. The letter was addressed to Alfred Brierly. Yap did not post it immediately. According to her subsequent account, the envelope got wet, and she had to open it to transfer the letter to a new envelope, and in so doing she read the contents. Whether this account is entirely accurate, whether the letter was opened deliberately or accidentally, whether Yap read it in full before forming a view about its significance, these are matters that the defense raised with force and that the prosecution answered inadequately. The letter to Brierly was, in its way, a devastating document. It was not a love letter in the conventional sense. It was a letter from a frightened and desperate woman telling her lover that her husband was seriously ill and asking him what she should do about their situation. It spoke of James's condition in terms that were not those of a devoted wife anxious for her husband's recovery. It referred to the need for Brierly to act, though the precise nature of the action she was urging him to was ambiguous enough to sustain two very different interpretations. The prosecution read the letter as evidence of a guilty mind, a woman who knew that her husband was dying of poison she had administered, who was communicating with her lover about the aftermath, and who was in a state of guilty agitation about the situation she had created. The defense read it as the letter of a frightened and unhappy woman in a terrible marriage who was reaching out to someone she cared about in a moment of crisis, with no criminal significance whatever. Yap took the letter to Michael Maybrick, James's brother, who had come to Battlecrease House to help manage the household during the illness. Michael read it. He then contacted Edwin, the other brother. The brothers confronted the situation with the particular energy of men who had already been suspicious of Florence, and who now felt that their suspicions were confirmed. They effectively took control of Battlecrease House, removed Florence from the sick room, and began preparations for a more formal investigation. James Maybrick died on May 11, 1889, Chapter 6. The post-mortem and the arrest. James Maybrick was 50 years old when he died at Battlecrease House on the evening of May 11, 1889. His death was not, in the immediate circumstances, treated as suspicious. He had been ill for several weeks. He had been attended by doctors, and the general assumption of those present was that he had died of the gastric illness that had been troubling him. The death certificate, initially, reflected this view, but the letter to Brierly had changed the atmosphere entirely. Michael and Edwin Maybrick were convinced that something was wrong, and they made their concerns known to the authorities with sufficient speed and force that a post-mortem examination was arranged. Dr. Richard Humphreys and other medical men examined the body. They found arsenic. The quantity was not enormous, not by the standards of a dramatic Victorian poisoning case, but it was present, and its presence transformed the death of James Maybrick from a sad domestic event into a potential murder. Florence was placed under a form of informal house arrest even before any formal legal process had been initiated. The Maybrick brothers ensured that she was kept at Battlecrease House under supervision. Her personal possessions were searched, and various items were found that the prosecution would later deploy with considerable effect: medicine bottles, a packet of arsenic labeled as such, and the famous flypapers soaking in their washbowl. On May 14, 1889, Florence Maybrick was formally arrested and charged with the murder of her husband. She was 26 years old, the mother of 2 young children, an American citizen in a foreign country, and she was facing a charge that, if sustained, would result in her execution. Her mother, the indomitable Carrie Chandler, who had long since remarried and was now the Baroness von Roques, rushed to England from the continent and threw herself into the task of defending her daughter with an energy and a determination that was, for a generation of observers on both sides of the Atlantic, one of the most compelling elements of the entire story. The case attracted immediate and intense press coverage in both Britain and America. In the United States, where Florence was regarded as an American citizen being persecuted by the British legal system. The sympathies of the public and the press ran strongly in her favor from the beginning. In Britain, the coverage was more mixed, reflecting the class anxieties and gender assumptions of Victorian society, but the case was followed with extraordinary avidity by readers at every social level. The trial, when it came, would be one of the most widely reported legal proceedings in the history of Victorian Britain. Chapter 7. The trial opens at St. George's Hall. The Trial of Florence Maybrick opened on July 31, 1889, at St. George's Hall in Liverpool, the magnificent neoclassical building that housed the Crown Court for the Assize of the Northern Circuit. The choice of Liverpool as the venue had the advantage of being the natural jurisdiction for a crime allegedly committed in the city, and the disadvantage, from the defendant's perspective, of placing her in a court surrounded by people who had known James Maybrick personally and who were embedded in the same social world from which the evidence against her had largely emerged. The presiding judge was Mr. Justice Stephen, Sir James Fitzjames Stephen, one of the most distinguished legal figures of the Victorian era, a man whose career had included service as a law member of the Viceroy's Council in India, the authorship of a celebrated digest of English criminal law, and a reputation for intellectual rigor and personal forcefulness that had made him one of the most formidable presences on the bench. He was 60 years old at the time of the Maybrick trial, and it would later become clear, though it was not fully apparent at the time, that he was in the early stages of a mental deterioration that would end his judicial career within 2 years, and his life within 5. For the prosecution, the Crown was represented by John Addison, a Queen's Counsel of considerable experience, who was assisted by Thomas Swift. The prosecution's case rested on the arsenic found in the body, the flypapers, the letter to Brierly, the incident with the meat extract bottle, and the general picture of a woman who had both the motive and the means to poison her husband and who had been observed doing suspicious things with substances that could have been used for that purpose. For the defense, Florence was represented by Sir Charles Russell, later to become Lord Chief Justice of England and Wales, who was at this point at the peak of his powers as an advocate, and who brought to the case a forensic intelligence and a passionate commitment to his client that would be tested, in the days that followed, to its absolute limit. Russell was assisted by William Pickford. The defense team faced a case that was circumstantial in its structure, but cumulatively damaging in its effect, and they knew that their best chance lay in attacking the quality of the scientific evidence and in undermining the credibility of the prosecution's most important witnesses. Chapter 8. The medical evidence contested. The medical evidence at the Maybrick trial was, in the view of many contemporary observers and of most subsequent legal historians, the weakest part of the prosecution's case, and yet it was also, paradoxically, the part that the jury appeared to find most persuasive. Understanding why requires some appreciation of the state of Victorian forensic medicine and of the particular difficulties that the Maybrick case presented to the scientists who were asked to interpret the evidence. The central problem was this: the quantity of arsenic found in James Maybrick's body was not large by the standards of arsenic poisoning cases. The prosecution's witnesses, led by Dr. Edward Davies, argued that the presence of arsenic in the quantities found was consistent with poisoning and inconsistent with any other explanation. The defense, led by a formidable array of expert witnesses, argued that the quantities were entirely consistent with the arsenic that a habitual arsenic taker like James Maybrick, whose habit was by now well documented in the evidence, naturally accumulate in his tissues over years of regular use. The defense's argument on this point was, scientifically speaking, a serious one. The habitual arsenic taker defense had been used in criminal cases before, most recently and most famously in the trial of Madeline Smith 2 years earlier in Scotland, and the scientific literature on the subject, such as it was in 1889, genuinely supported the proposition that a person who took arsenic habitually could accumulate significant quantities in their tissues, without those quantities necessarily indicating deliberate external poisoning. Charles Russell cross-examined the prosecution's medical witnesses with the controlled ferocity that was his professional signature. He pressed Dr. Davies and his colleagues on the specific quantities involved, on the distribution of arsenic in different organs, on the alternative explanations for the findings, and on the limitations of the analytical methods then available. He elicited admissions of uncertainty that the prosecution had not anticipated, and that undermined the confident tone of the expert testimony that had preceded them. He demonstrated, with considerable effectiveness, that the medical evidence was not the clear-cut proof of poisoning that the prosecution had presented it as. The defense also addressed the question of what James Maybrick had actually died of. The prosecution argued he had died of arsenic poisoning. The defense argued with some plausibility that his death was the result of a combination of the gastric illness from which he had been suffering and the effects of his own long-term arsenic consumption, aggravated possibly by other substances he had been taking, none of which had been administered by Florence. The defense produced evidence of James's various medical consultations, his known consumption of strychnine and other stimulants, and his generally precarious state of health, to argue that he was a man who had been undermining his own constitution for years and who had finally paid the price. Chapter 9. The Flypapers and the Cosmetic Defense. The flypaper evidence was, in many ways, the most visually dramatic element of the prosecution's case against Florence Maybrick, and it occupied a substantial portion of the trial's attention. The image of a woman soaking flypapers in a washbowl, while her husband lay ill in the next room, was one that caught the imagination of both the court and the press, and it required careful handling by the defense. Charles Russell addressed it directly and at length. He produced evidence from medical and scientific witnesses that the cosmetic use of arsenic was genuinely widespread among Victorian women, that the specific practice of soaking flypapers to obtain arsenic solution was documented in various popular handbooks of domestic chemistry and beauty preparation, and that there was nothing inherently suspicious about the purchase and preparation of flypapers for this purpose. He produced witnesses who testified to having used such preparations themselves, and who confirmed that the practice was regarded, in the domestic economy of the period, as an entirely normal, if slightly unconventional beauty treatment. He also produced testimony about Florence's own long-standing use of arsenic-based cosmetic preparations, arguing that the flypaper episode was consistent with a habit she had maintained for years, and that the timing, coinciding as it did with her husband's illness, was a coincidence rather than evidence of criminal intent. The prosecution countered by noting that the quantity of arsenic that could be extracted from a supply of flypapers was considerably more than would be needed for any reasonable cosmetic application, and that the specific preparation of a solution in a washbowl in the bedroom was an unusual method compared with the commercial arsenic preparations that were readily available. The jury listened to both sides of this argument with, as far as can be determined from the subsequent record, considerable attention. Whether they were ultimately persuaded by the defense's explanation of the flypapers is unclear, but the tone of the judge's subsequent treatment of this evidence suggested that he, at least, did not find it entirely convincing, and his influence on the jury's assessment would prove to be a matter of profound controversy. The incident with the meat extract bottle was handled with equal care by both sides. Nurse Yap's observation of Florence doing something with the bottle was, as Russell demonstrated in cross-examination, vague enough to carry relatively little independent evidential weight. What Yap had seen was a woman handling a bottle, an act that could have 100 innocent explanations in the context of a sick room. The arsenic subsequently found in the bottle was present in very small quantities that the defense argued were entirely consistent with contamination from the various medicines and treatments that had been in use throughout James's illness. Chapter 10. Alice Yap and the Opened Letter. The evidence of Alice Yap was among the most hotly contested of the entire trial, and the cross-examination of Yap by Charles Russell was one of the highlights of an already dramatic proceeding. Yap was a young woman who occupied the position of nursemaid in the Battlecrease household, and her evidence was central to the prosecution's case in two important respects. First, she had allegedly observed Florence doing something suspicious with the meat extract bottle. Second, and more importantly, She had intercepted and read the letter that Florence had given her to post to Alfred Brierly. Russell attacked Yap's account of the letter with particular vigor. He focused on her explanation for having opened it, the claim that it had become wet and needed to be transferred to a new envelope, and he challenged this account on several grounds. The weather on the day in question had not been particularly wet. The envelope showed no signs of water damage that would have necessitated its opening. The contents of the letter, once read, were the kind of contents that a person with a grievance against Florence Maybrick might have found very useful, and the manner in which Yap had acted on reading the letter, taking it directly to Michael Maybrick rather than posting it as she had been instructed, suggested a purposefulness that was difficult to reconcile with an accidental discovery. Russell suggested, without stating it baldly, that Yap had opened the letter deliberately, had read it with deliberate attention, and had taken it to Michael Maybrick because she wanted to cause trouble for Florence, with whom her relationship was known to be poor. This was a serious imputation of dishonesty against a witness in a capital case, and it required Russell to walk a careful line between effective advocacy and the kind of attack on a witness's character that could generate jury sympathy in the wrong direction. Yap maintained her account under cross-examination with a consistency that frustrated Russell's attempts to break it open. She acknowledged that her relationship with Florence had not been warm, but she denied any malicious intent. She maintained that she had opened the letter only from necessity, and had read it only to understand why it needed to be resealed. The jury, watching this confrontation, had to form their own view of which account was more credible, and the fact that Yap was a domestic servant testifying against her employer in a murder case, in a court full of people from the same social world as the Maybrick family, was a context that could cut in various directions. The reading of the Brierly letter in court was, regardless of questions about how it had been obtained, one of the prosecution's most effective moments. The letter showed Florence in a state of agitation about her husband's condition that was not consistent with the behavior of a purely innocent woman. It showed her communicating with her lover at a moment of crisis, and it provided the prosecution with its most human and most emotionally resonant piece of evidence in a case that might otherwise have risked becoming entirely absorbed in the technicalities of arsenic chemistry. Chapter 11. Charles Russell's Defense. Charles Russell's conduct of Florence Maybrick's defense was, in the judgment of virtually all subsequent commentators, brilliant within the constraints that the evidence imposed upon it. He was working with a client whose personal conduct, whatever her criminal responsibility, had been far from impeccable, and he had to construct a defense that acknowledged the realities of her situation without conceding anything that could be used to convict her. His opening address established the framework within which the defense would operate throughout the trial. He acknowledged Florence's affair with Brierly, doing so directly and without equivocation, on the grounds that the prosecution would inevitably reveal it, and that it was better for the defense to present it in its own terms than to allow the prosecution to deploy it as a revelation. He argued that an unhappy marriage and an extramarital attachment were not evidence of murder. He reminded the jury that the question before them was not whether Florence Maybrick was a perfect wife or a perfect woman, but whether the prosecution had proved beyond a reasonable doubt that she had deliberately poisoned her husband. He returned repeatedly to the question of James Maybrick's own arsenic consumption. He presented evidence of James's long-standing habit from multiple witnesses, including a doctor who had been aware of the habit and had cautioned Maybrick about it. He argued that James Maybrick was a man who had been slowly poisoning himself for years, and that the arsenic in his body at the time of his death was, in the most straightforward sense, his own arsenic, accumulated through his own choices and his own habit, and not the product of any external administration by Florence. He attacked the flypaper evidence with the cosmetic defense already described, and he attacked the letter to Brierly with an argument about the circumstances of its interception that, while it could not make the letter disappear, forced the jury to consider the reliability of Yap's account. He challenged the medical evidence with expert witnesses of his own, whose testimony established, to the satisfaction of at least some of those listening, that the scientific case against Florence was considerably less conclusive than the prosecution had represented it to be. But Russell's single most powerful move, and the one that had the most lasting effect on the public assessment of the trial, was his extended and eloquent appeal to the jury on behalf of Florence herself as a person. He painted her, in terms that the contemporary press found deeply affecting, as a young American woman far from home, in an unhappy marriage, who had made one serious moral mistake, and who now faced the prospect of dying for a crime she had not committed, on evidence that was circumstantial, contested, and insufficient to meet the standard that English law required for a conviction in a capital case. He spoke of her children, of her mother's devotion, of the particular vulnerability of her position in a foreign legal system whose ways and customs she had no experience of navigating. Chapter 12. Judge Stevens' Summing Up. The summing up delivered by Mr. Justice Stephen in the Maybrick case is one of the most controversial judicial performances in the history of Victorian criminal law. It was, by any objective assessment, deeply and damagingly unfavorable to the defendant, in ways that went considerably beyond what the evidence and the conventions of impartial judicial summary warranted. Contemporary observers were divided in their reactions to it, but subsequent generations of legal historians, with the advantage of hindsight and without the immediate social pressures of the moment, have been largely united in their criticism. Stephen began his summing up on the 8th day of the trial and continued across 2 days of court time. He covered the evidence in great detail, but his coverage was not even-handed. He treated the prosecution's evidence with a deference and an approval that he did not extend to the defense's case, and he addressed the jury in terms that made his own conclusion clear, if any member of the jury had been in any doubt about it. On the question of the medical evidence, Stephen largely endorsed the prosecution's interpretation, treating the arsenic found in James Maybrick's body as evidence of deliberate poisoning, while giving relatively short shrift to the defense's arguments about habitual arsenic consumption and its effects. He did not misstate the evidence exactly, but his selection and emphasis told a story that was consistently less favorable to Florence than the actual balance of the evidence warranted. On the question of the letter to Brierly, Stephen was particularly severe. He addressed the jury in terms that made plain his view that the letter reflected a guilty mind, and that the affair with Brierly provided a sufficient motive for the poisoning of a husband who stood between Florence and the freedom she evidently desired. He was, in this part of his summing up, treating moral judgment as if it were evidentiary analysis, allowing his assessment of Florence's character and conduct to color his treatment of the specific facts. There is now a broad consensus among legal historians that Stephen's mental deterioration, which had probably begun before the Maybrick trial, affected the quality of his judicial performance in ways that had direct consequences for the verdict. He was, at 60 years old, and in the early stages of what would prove to be a progressive neurological condition, still capable of great intellectual clarity in some areas, but subject in others to a loss of the precise discrimination and scrupulous impartiality that the conduct of a capital trial demanded. The Maybrick summing up is generally cited as one of the clearest examples of this deterioration. Charles Russell, listening from the defense bench, was clearly alarmed by what he was hearing, and his intervention at several points, technically improper, but made with the controlled urgency of a man who believed his client's life was being compromised by judicial bias, created moments of tension in the courtroom that were reported in detail by the journalists present. The interventions did not change the direction of the summing up. They did, however, create a record of protest that would later form part of the basis for the campaign to have the conviction reviewed. Chapter 13. Guilty and the public reaction. On August 7, 1889, the jury in the Maybrick case retired to consider their verdict. They were out for approximately 40 minutes, a period of deliberation that in a case of this complexity and consequence was disconcertingly brief. When they returned, the foreman delivered a verdict of guilty on the charge of murder. Florence Maybrick, 26 years old, and the mother of 2 children, was sentenced to death by hanging. The reaction in the courtroom was immediate and intense. There were cries from the public gallery. Florence herself, who had maintained a remarkable composure throughout the trial, visibly struggled to contain her distress as the sentence was pronounced. Outside the court, the reaction was, in various quarters, one of shock. The brevity of the deliberation, the severity of the sentence, and the widespread sense that the judge's summing up had been less than impartial combined to produce, within days, a public controversy of a scale that the Victorian legal establishment had rarely encountered. In America, the reaction was explosive. The case had been followed closely in the American press from the beginning, and the verdict was received with something approaching national outrage. Florence Maybrick was an American citizen, and her treatment at the hands of the British legal system was seen, across the Atlantic, as a fundamental injustice. American newspapers, American civic organizations, and eventually American diplomatic channels were all engaged in pressing for a review of the verdict. The American consul in Liverpool took an active role in supporting Florence's case, and the matter became, to a degree that made the British Foreign Office uncomfortable, a diplomatic issue between the two countries. In Britain, the reaction was more complex but ultimately not much less damaging to the authorities who had prosecuted the case. Petitions for clemency were organized and attracted hundreds of thousands of signatures, a figure that represented an extraordinary public mobilization by the standards of the period. Legal figures of distinction, including former attorneys general and prominent barristers, added their voices to the criticism of the trial. Newspapers that had initially been unsympathetic to Florence revised their positions as the detail of the summing up became more widely known and analyzed. The Home Secretary, Henry Matthews, was placed in an invidious position. He could not simply overturn a jury verdict, and the political and institutional pressures against doing so were considerable. But the weight of public opinion, both domestic and American, was becoming impossible to ignore. After a review of the case, and after consultation with medical and legal advisors, Matthews announced that Florence Maybrick's sentence would be commuted to life imprisonment. She would not hang, but she would go to prison. Chapter 14. 15 years in prison. Florence Maybrick entered Woking Prison in the autumn of 1889 and remained in the British prison system for 15 years. The conditions she endured during those years were, by any measure, extremely harsh, and the harshness was compounded by the particular circumstances of her case, the sustained public interest that meant she was never allowed to fade into the obscurity that might have made her imprisonment more manageable, and the ongoing uncertainty about her legal status, which meant that every attempt to secure her release became a public and political event. Her children, Bobo and Gladys, were taken from her. They were placed under the guardianship of the Maybrick family, and Florence was separated from them with a completeness that was, even by the standards of Victorian prison practice, unusually severe. The children grew up without their mother. Bobo died young. Gladys survived, but had little contact with Florence during the years of imprisonment. The destruction of the maternal relationship was, for Florence, and for those who followed her case sympathetically, one of the most painful aspects of her situation. Her mother, the Baroness von Roques, continued the campaign for her release with a determination and a transatlantic energy that never entirely faltered. She wrote pamphlets, she lobbied politicians, she maintained contact with American diplomatic representatives, and she kept Florence's case before the public with a persistence that was, depending on one's perspective, either entirely admirable or somewhat excessive. She wrote and published Florence's own account of the case, in which Florence maintained her innocence and set out her version of the events that had led to her conviction. Various legal and political figures continued to press the case for Florence's release in the years following the trial. The questions about the quality of the medical evidence, about the fairness of the summing up, and about the broader sufficiency of the prosecution's case did not become less pressing with the passage of time. If anything, as the specific features of the trial became more widely analyzed in the legal literature, the criticisms became sharper and more specific. The consensus that the trial had been flawed was, by the late 1890s, fairly widespread among those who had studied it carefully. Florence was finally released from Aylesbury Prison on January 25, 1904, having served 15 years. She had entered prison as a young woman of 26. She emerged at 41, her health impaired, her children strangers to her, her marriage, her social position, and a substantial part of her adult life consumed by the machinery of a legal process whose justice she had never accepted and whose outcome the public had never entirely endorsed. Chapter 15. Life after Prison. Florence Maybrick's life after her release from prison in 1904 is a story of remarkable resilience, combined with the particular sadness of a person who has lost, in the years of their imprisonment, the connections and the context that make ordinary life possible. She was 41 years old, her mother was aging, and would die within a few years. Her children were effectively lost to her, and the society from which she had come, Liverpool's merchant class of the 1880s, was as remote from her present reality as if it belonged to a different century. She went first to France, where she spent some months attempting to recover her health and to consider her future. She wrote a memoir, Mrs. Maybrick's Own Story, which was published in 1905, and which combined a detailed account of her trial and imprisonment with her continued insistence on her innocence and her critique of the legal process that had convicted her. The book attracted considerable attention on both sides of the Atlantic and renewed public interest in her case, though it did not produce any formal legal reconsideration. She eventually returned to America, the country of her birth, and settled in the northeastern United States, where she tried to build a new life under a degree of anonymity that was never entirely achievable. She gave lectures about her experience of the British prison system, speaking to audiences that were drawn partly by genuine interest in prison reform, which was a live public issue of the period, and partly by the celebrity that her case had generated. She was, for a time, a figure of some public prominence, though the prominence was always uncomfortably associated with the trial and the conviction, rather than with anything she had done or made since. In her later years, Florence Maybrick settled in South Kent, Connecticut, where she lived in increasing poverty and isolation. She was by then a very old woman whose fame had faded into the particular obscurity of someone who was known to those who had studied the period, but was otherwise forgotten. She died in October 1941, at the age of 79, in a small house in a Connecticut town, alone enough at the end that it was several days before her death was discovered. It was, for a woman whose life had been played out on so public a stage, an extraordinarily quiet ending. Chapter 16. Was she guilty? The question of Florence Maybrick's guilt or innocence has been debated for more than 130 years, and it has not, in all that time, been resolved to the satisfaction of those on either side of the argument. The legal verdict is clear. She was convicted of murder by a jury of her peers, and the conviction was not overturned. But the quality of the legal process that produced that verdict has been so widely and so thoroughly criticized that the verdict itself carries less authority than it might otherwise do, and the historical question of what actually happened at Battle Crease House in the spring of 1889 remains genuinely open door. The case for Florence's guilt rests primarily on the circumstantial evidence of the flypapers, the meat extract bottle, and the pattern of her conduct during her husband's illness, taken together with the letter to Brierly as evidence of motive. The prosecution's theory was coherent. The individual pieces of evidence were not trivial, and a jury in 1889 could reasonably have concluded, on the basis of what they heard, that Florence had administered arsenic to her husband in a deliberate attempt to kill him. The prosecution had a story that was internally consistent and not lacking in evidential support. The case against the conviction is, however, substantial and has grown more substantial with time. The medical evidence was genuinely ambiguous. The quantity of arsenic in James Maybrick's body was not large, and the defense's argument about habitual arsenic consumption was, and remains, scientifically credible. The flypapers could have been purchased for cosmetic purposes, exactly as Florence claimed. The meat extract bottle evidence was thin. The letter to Brierly, however damaging in atmosphere, did not say what the prosecution represented it as saying, and the summing up was, by the judge's own later implicit acknowledgement, and by the explicit assessment of most legal historians, badly biased against the defendant. The broader context also matters. James Maybrick was a man whose own habits had been destroying his health for years. He consumed arsenic, strychnine, and various other stimulants and tonics in quantities that his doctors found alarming. He had a gastric constitution that was, by the spring of 1889, severely compromised. A man in that condition, taking the substances he was taking, might well die of causes that had nothing to do with his wife's intervention. The arsenic in his body might have been his own arsenic, exactly as the defense contended. And if it was, then the entire prosecution's case collapses. There is also the question of what Florence's motive actually was. The prosecution argued that she wanted to be free of James in order to pursue her relationship with Brierly. But by the spring of 1889, the relationship with Brierly had already effectively ended. His behavior during and after the trial, which was characterized by a notable absence of support for the woman he had supposedly loved, and for whom she was now risking everything, suggested that Florence's attachment to him was not mutual to the degree the prosecution implied. If freedom from James in order to be with Brierly was the motive, the relationship that was supposed to make that freedom worthwhile was already falling apart before James died. Chapter 17. The role of James Maybrick's brothers. The role of Michael and Edwin Maybrick in the events that led to Florence's arrest and conviction deserves careful consideration, because it is one of the aspects of the case that subsequent analysis has found most troubling, and that the trial itself addressed least adequately. Michael Maybrick was, at the time of the events of 1889, a famous man. He was a celebrated baritone and music hall performer who appeared under the stage name Stephen Adams, and who had written several popular songs, including the enormously successful Nancy Lee, that had made him wealthy and well known throughout Britain. He was also, by the accounts of those who knew him well, a man of considerable personal force and strong opinions, and he had never been particularly fond of his brother's American wife. When Michael arrived at Battlecrease House during James's illness and received the intercepted letter from Yap, he moved with a speed and a decisiveness that, in retrospect, is striking. He removed Florence from the sick room, effectively confining her to her own quarters under a supervision that amounted to house arrest before any legal authority had been involved. He took control of the household. He arranged for the post-mortem. He was, in the most material sense, the engine of the process that led to Florence's arrest. The defense raised questions about whether Michael's actions were entirely disinterested. The Maybrick estate, after James's death, was worth a substantial amount, and the disposition of that estate was materially affected by what happened to Florence. If Florence was convicted of murder, her children's claims on the estate and the administration of those claims would rest in the hands of the Maybrick family. If Florence was acquitted, and the marriage survived her husband's death as a natural event, her own legal position and her children's position would be entirely different. These were not trivial considerations. The defense also raised questions about the reliability of the evidence that the Maybrick brothers had assembled and presented to the authorities. Several of the most damaging pieces of circumstantial evidence, including the arsenic packet found in Florence's possession and the evidence about the flypapers, had been found and handled by people who were in the brothers' orbit before any formal orbit. Investigation had secured the scene. The possibility of contamination, whether deliberate or accidental, was not something that the trial examined with the thoroughness it deserved. Chapter 18. Victorian Women and Poison. The Maybrick trial cannot be fully understood without some appreciation of the particular cultural anxieties that surrounded the figure of the female poisoner in Victorian Britain. Anxieties that were far more powerful and far more pervasive than a modern observer might expect, and that played a direct role in shaping the reception of the case in the press, the public, and, arguably, in the courtroom itself. The Victorian era was, paradoxically, both a period in which women's domestic authority was celebrated and idealized, and a period in which that same domestic authority was a source of profound cultural anxiety. Women controlled the household. Women prepared the food. Women dispensed the medicines. Women were present in the sick room. And arsenic, the great domestic poison of the Victorian period, was everywhere in the Victorian home, in flypapers, in rat poison, in cosmetic preparations, in wallpaper dye, in 100 domestic applications. The combination of female domestic authority and the ubiquity of arsenic created a specific cultural fear, the fear of the wife who poisoned her husband, that Victorian society found deeply disturbing precisely because it attacked the institution it most cherished. This anxiety was fed by a number of celebrated cases in the decades before the Maybrick trial. Mary Ann Cotton, convicted and executed in 1873 for the arsenic poisoning of numerous members of her family, had created a template of the female poisoner that retained its cultural power for decades. The Madeline Smith case had reinforced it, and the social position of women who lacked independent legal identity under the doctrine of coverture, who had no right to divorce on grounds of adultery alone until 1923, and who were effectively trapped within marriages that the law did not allow them to leave without catastrophic social and financial consequences, meant that the motive for such poisonings was always easy to construct. Florence Maybrick was, in a sense, the prisoner of this cultural script as much as she was the prisoner of Battlecrease House. The moment the prosecution established that she had purchased flypapers and that her husband had arsenic in his body, the narrative wrote itself in the minds of many who heard about the case, and not all of them were in the jury box. The specific facts, the actual quantity of arsenic, the alternative explanations, the quality of the evidence were all less powerful in their influence on public perception than the cultural script that had been primed by 20 years of female poisoner cases, and that the Maybrick prosecution was only too happy to invoke. Chapter 19. The Legal Legacy. The Maybrick case left a significant mark on British legal history, and its influence can be traced in several directions that extend well beyond the immediate circumstances of Florence Maybrick's trial and imprisonment. The most direct and most immediate consequence was the reform of the rules governing judicial summing up in capital cases. The controversy over Stephen's performance in the Maybrick case was one of several factors that contributed, in the years following 1889, to a greater awareness among both judges and the legal establishment of the dangers of unbalanced judicial direction to juries. The principle that a judge's summing up in a capital case should present the evidence of both sides with equal fairness, that it should not become an instrument of prosecution in judicial clothing, was not in itself new, but the Maybrick case gave it a vivid and widely known illustration of what happened when that principle was not observed. The case also contributed, more broadly, to the movement for criminal appeals. At the time of Florence Maybrick's trial, there was no court of criminal appeal in England. A convicted defendant had no right to appeal to a superior court on questions of law or fact. The only recourse was to the Home Secretary, who could exercise the royal prerogative of mercy, and who was subject to political pressures of various kinds that had nothing to do with the legal merits of any individual case. The obvious inadequacy of this arrangement, illustrated by cases like the Maybrick case, where the conviction was widely believed to be unsafe but could not be formally reviewed, was one of the driving arguments for the establishment of the Court of Criminal Appeal, which was finally created by the Criminal Appeal Act of 1907. The case was also significant in the development of forensic toxicology as a discipline. The contest between expert witnesses over the interpretation of the arsenic findings in James Maybrick's body highlighted, with particular clarity, the limitations of the analytical methods available in 1889 and the dangers of overstating the certainty of forensic conclusions in a capital case. In the decades that followed, British forensic medicine made significant advances in the precision and reliability of its methods, and the Maybrick case is cited in the literature as one of the impetuses for those advances. The case's impact on the relationship between Britain and the United States was also not negligible. The American outrage at Florence's conviction and the diplomatic pressure that the American government felt obliged to apply on her behalf were a source of genuine embarrassment for successive British administrations, and the episode contributed a small but real way to a heightened awareness in British legal and political circles of the international dimensions of high-profile criminal cases involving foreign nationals. Chapter 20. A Question Without an Answer. Florence Maybrick died in her small Connecticut house in October of 1941, 79 years old, poor, and largely forgotten by the world that had once been fascinated by her story. The case that had consumed her life, that had sent her to prison for 15 years, that had killed her children's childhoods, and destroyed everything she had built in the first 26 years of her existence, was by then a matter of legal and historical record rather than living controversy. The people who had prosecuted her, defended her, judged her, and sentenced her were all long dead. James Maybrick had been in his grave for more than 50 years. Even the generation that had followed the trial in the newspapers as a current event was mostly gone. And yet the question that the trial of 1889 had been convened to answer, and that the jury had answered in 40 minutes in a direction that the world had been arguing about ever since, was no closer to resolution than it had ever been. Did Florence Maybrick poison her husband? The honest answer, after 130 years of examination, remains the same as it was in 1889. We do not know. We cannot know. The evidence that would settle the question definitively does not exist, either because it never existed in the form that certainty would require, or because it has been lost in the passage of time, or because the events of that spring in Battle Crease House were witnessed only by the people who were there, and none of them told the complete truth. What we can say is that the trial that purported to answer the question was deeply flawed. The summing up was biased. The medical evidence was ambiguous and overstated in the prosecution's favor. The alternative explanation of James Maybrick's own arsenic habit was given insufficient weight. The conduct of the Maybrick brothers in the period before the formal investigation was not adequately scrutinized, and the cultural script of the female poisoner, powerful and pervasive in Victorian Britain, exercised an influence on the proceedings that had nothing to do with the specific evidence in this specific case. Florence Maybrick may have poisoned her husband. She had motive, or at least the prosecution constructed a motive from the evidence of her affair and her unhappy marriage. She had access to arsenic, or at least she had purchased the flypapers from which arsenic could be extracted. She was in the house. She was unhappy. She was desperate. These are the ingredients from which criminal acts are made, but they are also the ingredients from which false convictions are made, and the history of the criminal law is full of cases in which desperate, unhappy people in close proximity to the victims of natural deaths have been convicted of murders that been convicted of murders never occurred. The case of Florence Maybrick sits in the canon of Victorian criminal history, alongside the cases of Madeleine Smith and Lizzie Borden and a handful of others, as a case that resists the closure that criminal proceedings are supposed to provide. It raises questions about evidence, about proof, about the reliability of forensic science in its infancy, about the fairness of proceedings in which judicial bias goes uncorrected, and about the ways in which gender and class and cultural assumption infiltrate themselves into legal processes that are supposed to be governed by reason and by fact alone. These are not merely historical questions. They are questions that any criminal justice system in any period must confront. The specific technologies change. The specific social assumptions change. The specific rules of evidence and procedure change. But the fundamental challenge of determining with sufficient confidence what actually happened in a private place, at a private time, on the basis of evidence that is always incomplete and always interpreted through the lenses of those doing the interpreting, is a challenge that belongs not just to the Victorian era, but to every era. Florence Maybrick went to prison. She served 15 years. She emerged, continued, endured, and eventually died in obscurity. Whether she was a murderer who escaped the gallows through a commutation that luck and public opinion produced, or an innocent woman who was convicted of a crime that never occurred, and who paid a price that no subsequent official acknowledgement ever properly addressed, is a question that the evidence before us does not allow us to answer with confidence. It is, in that sense, the most honest kind of historical conclusion, not a verdict, but an acknowledgement of the limits of what we can know about the hidden lives of other people and the private acts they commit in the closed rooms of their own existence. The house at Battle Crease in Aigburth still stands, though it has changed considerably since the Maybricks lived in it. The city of Liverpool has been transformed beyond recognition from the Victorian merchant city where James Maybrick built his business and Florence tried to build her life. The social world that produced the trial, with all its rigidities and its anxieties and its intolerance of the kind of human messiness that Florence's story represented, has been swept away by a century and more of change. But the story itself remains, as these stories do, not because it provides answers, but because it poses questions that are, in the deepest sense, without resolution. This has been the story of Florence Maybrick, of James Maybrick, of Battlecrease House, and of a trial that produced a verdict that the world has been arguing about for more than 130 years. Thank you for listening.